noticing is that as we talk about particularly drug policy, but also criminal justice policy in general, but like drug policy in particular, I think is one of those places where there really are multifacets to this, right? We can talk about the prevention aspect. We can talk about early intervention and treatment components. We can talk about the law enforcement component. But we can, and all of these different components, and for so long it was really just about arresting and prosecuting, and this notion that if you make the punishment, if you make it uncomfortable enough, people will stop doing bad things to themselves, right? And others. I mean, I'm not one of those folks that say that drug abuse is a victimless crime. Having, you know, I'm a good Irish Catholic girl. You know, we have lots of addiction in our family, as most families do, right? We know that there are lots of circles that can be impacted in very profound ways when you have a loved one. There's probably nothing as heartbreaking as having a loved one struggling to the probably almost the point of death with drugs or alcohol. To watch them die slowly is an extremely painful and difficult thing. But what I love about where we are, and Senator Aguilar has done such a good piece of work in this area too, is we're starting to talk about other components. When we start talking about how do we know that there are barriers. When people are using drugs, it's called harm reduction. It's one of the main strategies in drug policy. When you talk about big picture comprehensive drug policy, you talk about harm reduction, which essentially is a public health approach that says we know that people are going to use drugs. You can say, you know, just say no, or this is your brain on drugs and fry an egg on TV, but we know that this is an aspect of our culture right now, and probably will be forever, and probably has been forever, right? But there are concrete things that we can do that try to mitigate some of the harm that's associated with drug use. So a lot of times that we'll look at strategies around reducing HIV and hepatitis C transmission, which often comes from sharing needles. Right? It may come from people overdosing unnecessarily because people are afraid to call 911 if they're using drugs together. And I think that's one of the most beautiful bills that is moving through the legislature that Senator Aguilar is the leader on. And I'm so grateful for that, because we're able to start talking about preventing death. When at the end of the day, would law enforcement be willing to give up the capacity to arrest in a very, very narrow situation where drug users, someone's in trouble, and they call 911, and police or emergency medical folks are on site? Would you give them immunity from using the drugs, from criminal prosecution, if it saves someone's life? And it's been really moving testimony. A mom whose son had died from ODing. And I didn't realize this, but for whatever reason, I was watching this documentary on River Phoenix the other night. Again, don't ask me why. But on so many levels. But what I didn't appreciate, River Phoenix was a very famous young actor in the mid-'80s, and he died outside the Viper Room in LA. And I just thought he had done too many drugs, and he was an addict, and everyone knew he was an addict, and then he just died on the sidewalk. What I didn't appreciate is that he'd done a speedball. So it was a combination of cocaine and heroin injected. Put his heart into all sorts of arrhythmias, and he went into he was disoriented, and they thought, oh, he just is hot, so we'll take him outside. And then he had a seizure, or what they thought was a seizure, and he collapsed on the sidewalk outside. What I didn't appreciate, he was with his brother and his sister, people who loved him and adored him, right? They didn't call 911 for about 9 minutes because they knew he'd been using drugs. Or at least that's when they realized he was using drugs. So they didn't call because they didn't want to get him in trouble. So they start doing these kinds of things like slapping him or shaking him or seeing if there's ways to revive him. These are not medical interventions, right? And he died. And so maybe he would have died if 911, because then once they finally did call 911, it was another 5 to 7 minutes before medical help arrived, right? So if you could take those 15 minutes, could his life have been saved? I don't know. But we know that 15 minutes didn't help, right? Delay in getting him care. And I think that's what your bill is offering us, is to be able to have that conversation that says, Yeah, even if we hate drugs, a lot of us don't like drugs, right? We don't want people to die because they're afraid. We don't want pregnant women not seeking prenatal care because they're afraid of going to jail. That there are some things that matter more in the scheme of things in that specific context than the fact that, well, they're committing a crime, so maybe they should just die, right? And that's what I love about the conversations are happening around drug policy are much broader and deeper and more human-centric than I think we can often lose sight of when we look at it just from the lens of criminal justice and prosecutions and incarceration and all this kind of stuff. So I'm very hopeful. And the thing that's fascinating, and it's a little bit of an aside, but it's a drug bill that I think is fascinating, have you guys heard of designer drugs? You know, so there are chemists out there who are very aware of what drugs are scheduled and made legal, and if you change enough of the chemical composition, they're not illegal because they don't fit under the definition of what is an illegal drug. And so they just sit around and they just manufacture this stuff. So last year there was a lot of conversation about synthetic, what they call cannabinoids, which is synthetic marijuana. And it's called spice, and it's sold in head shops and tobacco shops and all that kind of stuff. And people said gas stations, it's all over the place, right? So there was a bill last year to make it a crime. And so this is the catch-up, right? This is the tiger chase. This is the futility of the drug war. However you want to frame it, this is alive and a dynamic that's in our society right now. Is how do you stay in front of these designer drugs? And so last year it was synthetic marijuana. This year it's something called bath salts. And so, I have bath salts until it's a felony, and then I have to hire him to. But and I'll pass this around if you want. It's not illegal for you to have to touch this, just to let you know.
Not yet.
Not yet. Give it 60 days.
She wants it back, and I want you to know I was at a meeting, I think in August last year, where you passed the same packet around.
Yeah.
Yeah. A meeting at the District Attorney's Council's office.
Right.
With all the
and they were like,
attorneys.
Okay. And what I want, so how this is getting, and this is $20, 21 bucks, okay?
Wow.
It says on here, not for human consumption, right? And that it is mixed package with oil for a massage, right? Or put it in your bath for, you're not spending for all of us that have bought Calgon, you're not spending 21 bucks for a little Calgon, right, ladies? And so.
Single serving.
Yeah, really. So what this is actually methamphetamine. This is pharmacologically similar to methamphetamine, MDMA, ecstasy. It is a central nervous system stimulant. It is very dangerous. It can kill people. It has all of the side effects of other central nervous system stimulants, where you can have palpitations, you can become psychotic, because you don't sleep and then you do more, and you don't sleep and you do more. You can become psychotic. I mean, it's just a terrible, terrible substance. But because it's labeled not for human consumption, right, and because the chemical compound in here isn't technically illegal, then it's sold to minors, it's sold anywhere, right? We got this at a head shop. The fascinating thing, so there's a bill this session, it's Senate Bill 116, that Senator Foster is running, that makes this a crime, but what brings this composition under the definition of a Schedule I substance. But the debate that's happening now, which I think is a fabulous debate to be having, is her bill makes possession and use of this drug a misdemeanor. Whereas in 1352, drug possession was all a felony, even if it was for personal consumption. It's all a felony. And so she's saying in her bill, we need to draw a different line. For people that are dealing the drugs, then let's talk about the role of having a felony and the threat of prison or incarceration. But for users and people who are possessing this, do we really need to make them felons? And it passed unanimously out of its first committee with the misdemeanor for possession, and which I think is really the next step where we need to go in drug policy. We need to do a better differentiation between people who use drugs and people who possess drugs for use from those who are dealing, and one of the ways that we can do that is between better identifying what should be a misdemeanor offense versus a felony offense. But what I love about her bill, we did a whole bunch of research this summer, And believe it or not, the way this is packaged violates the Colorado Consumer Protection Act because it's mislabeled. And this is where the drug war may get interesting, because we're talking about now a civil strategy, not just a criminal strategy, right? They can change this chemical and the criminalization under Senate Bill 116 becomes useless. But in order to sell this in a tobacco shop or a head shop or a gas station, they have to label this as not for human consumption, which today and tomorrow and next week and next month and next year is against the law under the Consumer Protection Act. Because it is illegal to package and label products that don't tell, that intentionally misleads them as to what its use is. Nobody ever thought about that in relation to these designer drugs. I mean, here, it's a little bit of a strategy that's been picked up from some of the folks in New York are dealing with this as well. But it's a fascinating new, do we have to, because under the Colorado Consumer Protection Act, district attorneys and attorney generals have already the authority to go in and tell people cease and desist. And they can confiscate and destroy. If you want this off the shelves tomorrow, you could get this off the shelves today. If the district attorneys and attorney generals and the deputy attorney generals had a strategy to do that, because it is illegal currently, and we talked to the attorney general about that. But Senate Bill 116 is the first bill that actually connects the dot between designer drugs and the Consumer Protection Act. And so we're really as a deceptive trade practice. So I'm really excited as to what that potential could be. Again, when everything looks like a hammer, what do they say? When all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. We're starting to realize, oh, we have more tools in our toolbox. And I think at the end, whether they're harm reduction strategies, whether they're treatment strategies, whether they're civil strategies to protect the community, this is a trash drug. This will destroy your life, right? Was devastating testimony from a family friend who's, this was the irony, is a very close friend of the family's teenage son had gotten in trouble for smoking pot. So he was on probation and he couldn't smoke pot. And so somebody said, try this, because it won't show up in a drug test, right? Because he was being drug tested under probation. So he went from smoking dope to this, and this destroyed his life. I mean, he ended up being, he was an A student who all of a sudden was a runaway living on the streets of Los Angeles doing who knows what to be a meth addict, essentially. And what it took for that family to literally pull him out of the gutter of Los Angeles and get him back in, and now he's in college. But what a phenomenal odyssey that family went through, and this stuff is on the shelves. So I just think that's fascinating. The other thing that I think that's fascinating with regard to what's going on potentially with drug policy is the impact that the Federal Affordable Care Act may offer us. Because right now, and I think, ma'am, you were speaking to this earlier, on some levels you have to get into a system in order to access the treatment services, because they're subsidized through a system. So you have to get busted, or you have to end up in child welfare, or you have to end up in a system. We don't have good insurance coverage on this. There's gaps all over the place, even in Medicaid funding for treatment. But the thing that will be interesting is, and I think the state, you guys know more about this than I do, is looking at what is that substance abuse treatment benefit going to look like in Colorado. But for single men who don't have children, this could be one of the best ways for them to be able to access affordable substance abuse treatment that doesn't involve them being in a system. This is our accessing substance abuse and mental health treatment as part of health care. My point being that we might be able to turn the corner and really integrate mind, body, and spirit kind of in our healthcare strategies, which may take a huge load off of the criminal justice system and social service systems and other systems if this can be integrated into our sense of what healthcare means, access and care.
So one of the things I wanted to talk about related to this actually was that